Welcome back to the Corner of Story and Game, your podcast where narratives unfold and games come to life. I'm your host, Gerald Ford, and today we're going to embark on a thrilling quest into the heart of world building, along with Will Shen, the lead content director from Something Wicked Games. Formerly the design director at Bethesda Studios, Will brings a wealth of experience from such iconic titles as the Elder Scrolls series. So, join us as we unravel the arcane secrets of crafting immersive realms and explore Will's journey from the sprawling landscapes of Bethesda to the eagerly awaited Weirdsong. From navigating the challenges of narrative integration to wielding the power of player agency, this episode is going to be a masterclass in the art of building fantasy worlds. So, grab the chair by the fire and let's get into this. First of all, thank you for sitting down and taking the time to chat with me, Will.
Oh, thank you so much, Gerald. It's as I said, it's an honor to be here. You know, I've been listening to your podcast ever since you contacted me, and you've had a lot of great people on the show, so I'm really honored to be a part of this.
Oh, thanks, man. Before we dig into craft and world building, we're here today to dig into fantasy world building. But first of all, I want to hear your story. I want to know, how did you get here today? What was the journey like? What were the twists and turns?
Oh, sure. So I'm the lead content designer at Something Wicked Games. It is a new studio composed of a lot of industry veterans from all over the role-playing game world. And previous to that, I was a design director at Bethesda Game Studios. I was at Bethesda Game Studios for a total of 15 years, 14 and a half years, and then a 6-month internship with some gap time in between. So I was mainly in charge of the quest design department. I was lead quest designer on Starfield. I was the lead designer for Far Harbor, which was the big story expansion for Fallout 4, and I did the openings for Fallout 4 and then Skyrim.
The opening for Skyrim, that's either love it or hate it, don't you? Like, yeah, I personally loved it. Like, it was fun and cool, but yeah, that comes up every now and then. But fantastic.
Yeah. So, sometimes when I mention that I worked on the opening for Skyrim, I say you're welcome and I'm sorry. That's
a good way of doing it.
Everyone sees the beginning, and with Skyrim, people have played that game so many times from the beginning, so you see that opening multiple times. So, in many ways, it's an iconic opening, which is a big honor to be a part of. But like every time I run through it, I'm like, should I have made this shorter? I don't know. Get to the action sooner.
I'm going to do this lots, but spin off to the side for a second here. Taking some narrative design stuff recently, you've got me curious. The Skyrim intro, when you actually wrote it, like, let's talk craft for a second, then we'll go back to how you wrote. When you wrote that, did you write it as a cinematic in script format? How did you like technically on screen write that?
Oh yeah, so that was always conceived as being an engine. So the story is, so one of the lead designers was originally in charge of the beginning, and we were about a year from ship, and we still hadn't finished it. He was doing a lot of other things besides just the opening, right? Leading the project, doing a lot of the main quests, and so it was handed over to me, and they're like, "Well, we're going to put a small team together, finish the opening." So it was I sat down and I looked at what we had, but it was originally all conceived in the engine. So we had a tool called the Scene tool that is basically a conversation system, but it also manages AI state and behavior. So the whole thing was conceived as running within this tool. So there's like 40 different NPCs in this scene, and horses, right, that are all being told what to do at various times. And most of for our openings, that's usually the only time, in a Bethesda game where we are worried about the timing, right? At BGS, usually you're only concerned about game state, right? Like, this NPC is going to go over here and they'll get there eventually. And we only care about when they arrive, right? We don't actually have any concept of time, but in the opening, you care about time a lot, right? So it is very meticulously crafted with tons of these manual timers that are running. And that's also the reason why we had a whole deluge of very specific timing bugs, right? Like, is the horse is supposed to arrive at this point, and if it doesn't arrive at this point, the gate hasn't opened yet, And so if it gets ahead of the timer, it's going to slam its snoot right into the gate. So we had a lot of those kinds of bugs as we were developing the opening, but it was never conceived as a cinematic. It was always conceived as being in the engine.
Interesting. Okay. So can you share a pivotal moment maybe with me from Bethesda? Let's just touch back on your history a little bit. Something that you took from Bethesda that shaped who you are today as a writer and designer.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So when I got tapped to head up the design for Far Harbor, one of the big things that we wanted to do was to really push story and choice and consequences. So I did a treatment of the main story, and we were going to have 3 factions. So I was like, okay, we're going to have one ending each for the factions, and that, we only have a few months to do this, so that's going to keep everything in scope and be nice and contained. And when I handed that off to the design team, the designers that were in charge of the factions and the endings were like, well, but logically, you could also want to do this, and what if we do that? And if this happens, then obviously the player is going to want to do this. And I was really scared for a while there because I was like, oh man, like if I let them do all this stuff, like, who knows how long that's going to take. And, in the end, I decided, let's do it, right? Let's have you do everything you can think of. And then we would just talk through it every day as they were making progress on it. And it really told me something about the value of having a shared mission and goals that everyone believes in, right? Like they really wanted to accomplish what the expansion was set out to do. And if I had held them back, then we wouldn't have gotten all the surprises you find in that expansion, right? Like, they did things that I wouldn't have even thought of, right? And it also taught me a lesson about time. Right. When I was a designer in the trenches, you don't mind maybe working an extra hour here or there to put in something that you really want to put in. But when you're in charge and your decisions are causing other people to put in extra time, you really have a responsibility to make sure that time is worth it. Right. And, the real test of at least creative leadership is, does the team feel as pumped at the end as they do at the beginning? Like, do they feel like they have spent their time well? That's the real test.
Interesting. So is that something you're applying today at Something Wicked? Is that a lesson that you brought forward with you?
Oh yeah, it's a delicate balance, right? We're always talking about how do we do this in a way that makes sense, that's smart, that uses our time as wisely as possible, because we're a bunch of veterans. We've done this several times before. So we have a lot of painful lessons learned. But at the same time, the opposite can happen too. You can be too safe. Right. And you forget that, yes, this is really painful to do, but you got to do it. It's great. Right. It's what makes what we do special. So we have to also know when we have to unleash ourselves and really go for it. So we talk through things all the time, trying to find where that line is.
Nice. You mentioned working with the designers, and I'm sure it comes up a lot, how the idea of how important collaboration is between departments and across the whole scope of the company. Is that something you found? Is that another something you learned from Bethesda and before that you're applying today?
Oh yeah, collaboration between departments is really tricky, right? Because everyone has their own perspectives and skill set.
Yeah.
And there's like the practical organizational answer to that problem, which is, okay, we have to have you all work together, right, towards the same goal. Mm-hmm. So, for like big open world games, right, like we would often cut things up either by content chunks or regions, right, and say, okay, now we're going to put an artist and a couple members of the design team, all together, and they're going to work on it and meet regularly and test the game regularly. And I think that's a big part of it. And then, like, from a creative direction standpoint, though, like, again, that shared mission and shared space is really important, because you can't always group people up. At some point, someone's working on their own, right, on an individual thing, but it still has to sound like it's from the same orchestra, if that makes sense.
Yep.
And so they have to know the world and its rules and the sort of the box they're looking for, and also where we're heading, right? What's the guiding light that's going to make this one special? And if everyone knows that, then they can contribute, knowing that it's going to serve that purpose.
Typically, where does that vision? Where does that guiding light come from? I'm curious. This is personal curiosity. Where does that originate? Where does it come from?
Usually usually at the beginning, it comes from the top, right? Like, usually a couple of people kind of conceive of the basic idea of the game, like, oh, we're going to do a role-playing game, right? Or an open world role-playing game. Right. But really, when you get into production and you have, maybe 80 to 100 people, or even sometimes more, like, in Starfield, we had, I think it was at least 300 people, if not more, right? Like Bethesda Game Studios at that point was over 400 people across all the projects. And when you have that many people, the game itself actually ends up being the real arbiter, right? Like everyone needs to be playing the game and seeing what the game is telling you that it needs. And of course, everyone has a different interpretation of what those needs are. But then when you put them all together and look at how it all amalgamates, you can see that the game's telling you what it wants. And then the game itself ends up really becoming the creative director.
I like that. That makes sense. So, Word Song. Highly anticipated. I'm one of the fans who are eager to get a peek into this universe. What inspired it to start moving us towards world building here? What inspired the direction for that world? Where did that come from? What's pushing you now, and how is that different from your experiences before?
Oh yeah. So I can't talk too much about the world because we're in development, but what I can say is that I think one of the things I'm really excited about is that we're coming from all over. Right. Like, obviously, I have a background at Bethesda Game Studios, with The Elder Scrolls, Fallout, Starfield. But I'm working with people who worked on The Outer Worlds, Pillars of Eternity, Tyranny, which is a great Obsidian game if you haven't played it. And people who've worked on Star Wars. Right. And so these are incredible role-playing game developers, and they all have different experiences, and they've all tried different things. Right. Like you can't do everything in a video game. You always have to make trade-offs. And so even within the role-playing game genre, different shops do different things. And so it's been really great kind of talking through a lot of these issues with them and kind of figuring out what our shared language is going to be for this project, what this project's going to be. Mm-hmm. And I'm really excited that it's going to be this amalgamation, best of all worlds by the end of it.
Very cool. I cannot wait to see it. So in your role as lead content designer, what role does narrative play when it comes to this world building? How do you ensure that narrative intertwines with like lore and story arc and character development? How do you pull that all together in something expansive as what you've worked on?
For like a big role-playing game, I think the most important part of the narrative is establishing the setting. Right. Usually with these games, you start with the setting first, right? Because that's going to tell you so much about the tone and also the flavor of all the mechanics, right? You want things in the game to meet the flavor of the world, right? Skyrim is about the Dragonborn, right? So it had to have the shouts, right? Yeah. And dragons, right? Like you're going to need both those things. That dictates things. So the setting informs a lot. And it also gives you that base of how does the game think, right? And especially when it comes to the quests and the narrative, what characters talk about, right? The setting informs you. What are people worried about? What are we highlighting? What aspects of life are we highlighting? Because obviously we're only telling so many stories, so it has a narrower lens than the totality of real life. Right. So starting with setting versus the big thing, and then for me, quest design and narrative it's the supporting structure in the gameplay loop, right? You depart and engage in the gameplay loop, exploration and, things like, combat and collecting things. And then you're returning to, usually a quest hub or a settlement at the end and talking, and that's your downtime. And that is what's giving you both a refresher between jolts of activity, but also answering the question of why am I doing this? Why is it important?
That makes sense. How do you look for emotional beats?
That's hard, right? I think the thing that you have to do is leave yourself room for surprise, right? That's really those moments that really cause your hair to stand up from your skin. I think those are the surprising moments, right? Like, oh, I didn't think it was going to go there, or I didn't realize this character had this dark secret, or that this is where it was going. And so I think that in order to get that surprise, you really have to sort of let everyone kind of contribute to the overall story. That's one of the great things about working with a team is they can see things from different angles than what you're coming up with.
Yes.
And they can test things. Some of the great, like, especially like, I mean, when you do morality systems and you're doing evil options, some of the great evil options come from someone else being like, well, I don't like that person. I want to do this to them. And you're like, oh, well, that's actually pretty great. It's like playing Dungeons and Dragons, and you have the player that always does the chaotic option and is spoiling the plans. But that's where some of the great stuff comes from. And then I think, when you're writing individual characters, again, thinking of like surprise, you always want to be thinking about what are they keeping from you? What are the big secrets that they have that they would only reveal to someone close to them, and that can be something else too. That's something that you're revealing over time.
You mentioned Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
Do you play? How are you playing right now?
Oh yeah, I play Dungeons and Dragons. I'm actually in a game I played with Bruce Nesmith, who not only did I work with at Bethesda Game Studios, but wrote, I think, D&D second edition, right? Or was the editor?
Yep. Back in the day.
Yeah. And I'm playing a game. We actually just finished up a campaign of Gamma World, so did an edition for, and we're going back to D&D. So yeah, Dungeons and Dragons. Right
on. Is he DMing? Is he running it?
Yeah, he's running it.
Oh, yeah. I'm so jealous.
Oh, that's great. He's great. And, of course, he's from goes all the way back to the TSR days. So he knows all the tricks. And every time we're playing and I fall for some trap that should have been very obvious, I'm like, you got me again, Bruce. How do I keep not seeing it? Right? Like, but it's because, he has all that experience, and he is coming from a completely different perspective, having done it for so long. So and that's the best kind of twist from a game master, is the one you should have seen coming and you just didn't.
Yeah. Well, again, you're referencing back to that whole, the surprises, the things you're not expecting that come up along the way. It's all part of the storytelling art.
Yeah, I think surprise is like the most underestimated emotion in video game development. It's really special.
Very cool. I've had a chance to talk to a lot of those old TSR guys now, and it's amazing how many made the jump into video games. Like, we have the video games we have now because of guys like Bruce and like Jeff Grubb and all those folks, Dave Gross and the guys who jumped, or even David Gator, who worked at BioWare. His background originally was D&D and LARPing, and then he just used those skills. It's so cool.
Yeah, it's great. Zeb Cook, Lawrence Schick, right? Like, yes,
Lawrence.
And we owe so much to Dungeons and Dragons, right? The entire role-playing game genre, which is huge now, right? Not only, like, obviously there's the tabletop game itself, but then there's the whole genre of watching people play Dungeons and Dragons, role, and then of course Baldur's Gate 3, and it's really amazing, right? Like, whole new thing.
So cool. Okay, world building. Now I'm going to pull us back.
Yeah, absolutely.
In your opinion, and in your experience, what are the elements that are essential to good world building to hook people? Because there's been so many worlds over the years, and there's ones that really stick with us. What makes them special?
Yeah, I think the thing that makes those special is you can project yourself into the world, right? You may or may not want to live in the world. Some of the best settings you want to actually live in and inhabit, but even a setting that's pretty dark, like Squid Game, right? You don't want to live in Squid Game, right? Yeah, you're gonna die, right? The odds are not great for you. But after you watch Squid Game, you can't help but wonder what would happen to you if you were participating in it. What childhood games would they throw at you that you remember? What would be the deadly consequence, the twist in them? And then also, could you survive them or not? What would you do? What would your game plan be? And I think that is what makes some of these settings really impactful. When you keep thinking about it way after the movie or show or game is over, and you're thinking about it and you're thinking about what would I have done? What would I do? What would it be like to have gone through that myself? When you can picture yourself in there, that's when it's really special.
Neat. So keeping that in mind, What is your approach when it comes to world building? Like, I'm sure at some point you've done some pie in the sky, blue sky, big picture world building, but also like when you're in the trenches, adding something to a world. What is your approach there, like from a craft technical point of view?
Yeah, I think one thing I can say, like, again, going back to Far Harbor, there's a story there of like, we were originally conceiving it as, okay, we're going to have factions and they're going to be against each other, right? And I think originally we just had the two. It's like, okay, we're going to have the town of Far Harbor and we're going to have the children of Adam and they're going to be at each other's throats. And there was just something about the binary nature of that choice that didn't really feel satisfying. And that's when, I kind of came with the idea of, well, what if we have a third faction, right? There's an old, the old video game wisdom, the rule of threes, right? Three is usually the right number for a choice point. And so that's when, we started thinking about, oh, well, what if we have this sort of neutral arbitrator that is trying to mediate between the two groups? And that's when we had the idea of, well, why don't we make the synth colony? And so I think that's the thing that I kind of come to when I think about, world building and choices, like where's the balancing act there? If you have two extremes, right, that you're choosing between, that just ends up feeling too black and white. You really need that middle ground. And hopefully you're doing more than that. But like the triad, the three things is really where things in your world begin to stabilize.
How do you ensure that there's at least some semblance of reality? There's something there that makes it feel real, even when we're dealing with fantasy or science fiction.
Yeah, I think it's perspective, right? Fictional worlds are kind of at their core a narrow lens of viewing the real world, right? You're narrowing in on an aspect of life. And so you have to figure out what that lens is going to be, like, I think, for example, like Lord of the Rings, that one is really about the temptation of power, right? And the need to hold on to yourself, even though the world is offering you that you can be so much more than what you are, right? And then Game of Thrones, which comes later, is about, well, what if everyone doesn't think that way and takes as much power as possible all the time, and everyone is killing each other over the top spot, right? What would the world be like then? Those are both narrowing in on an aspect of life, right? You don't hear about in Lord of the Rings, unchecked ambition, except as a consequence that leads to villainy, right? Whereas in Game of Thrones, it's just happening all the time. Even characters you like are doing kind of bad things, right? Because they're just playing the game, And so those are two different perspectives. And so I think one of the cool things about storytelling and world building is that you're trying to narrow in on some aspect of life, right? Skyrim is it's the big Viking adventure, right? You're going to go to the top of the mountain and hunt a dragon, right? That's a very Beowulf kind of centered or Conan kind of centered story. Yeah. It's about dungeon delving and loot and becoming more powerful and fighting big monsters. Whereas like Fallout is about, living past the impossible, right? The world's ended, but we all have to keep going anyway. And there's room for a lot of zaniness, right? Like, crazy technology and aliens and things like that. But really, it's a meditation on the fact that life goes on even when we think that the world's over.
So, I mean, tell me I'm crazy and wrong, but it sounds like at the core of it, it's just about finding a human experience to illuminate and share and bring forth in one way or another.
Oh yeah, that's what it's all about. That's what we're doing all the time, right? That's one of the great questions. What makes us human? We don't know. And we've been poring over that probably since we've been able to communicate with one another. The weird thing about language and thought, right, is that there's an infinite space between minds, right? I can't know what you're thinking, but communicating with you, talking to you, or expressing myself, I'm trying to, right? What's going to bridge that gap? That's what makes art so fascinating. Is you're trying to express yourself and your relationship with the world around you, and your audience is trying to see themselves in your work. Right. You're both trying to bridge that gap, that space that exists between two minds. That's what it's all about.
And it's fantastic that video games are finally recognized as an art as opposed to just a hobby or pastime or activity. I think that's something that makes me really happy, at least in the last couple decades or decade and a half.
Yeah, and I'm really grateful and honored that that as an industry we've also sort of risen to that challenge, right? The variety of stories that get told in games now is so much more rich and is so much more compelling and deep and again surprising. Like you imagine a world where we have like The Last of Us, God of War, Skyrim, like Disco Elysium, Planescape Torment, and a host of like visual novels covering all aspects of life, Boyfriend Dungeon, right? Like isn't that great? All of these different stories, all these different aspects of humanity that people are playing with, there's so much.
Yeah, really. Have you, wandering off for a second, have you played Stray Gods, to talk about a game that's completely different and fun? And
I haven't yet. I need to play it because that's so up my alley, like musical RPG with mythology. That's so awesome.
a big part of world building is lore, building the lore. And I've talked to other people from big studios, including Bruce and others, about how lore is kept, managed, created, generated. There's everything from wikis to libraries of books. In your experience, what have you done? What has worked? Well, you probably can't talk about what you're doing now, but I know Bethesda had don't they have a big library? Or am I thinking of? Oh no,
I know the other Scrolls Online, like Lawrence was like the lore master for.
That's who it was. It was Lawrence.
That was a full-time job for them because they made so much content. They have done so much of all the Elder Scrolls lore. Like they've had the opportunity to really dig deep, And what's funny, one of my first jobs at Bethesda Game Studios when I was interning was they were building their lore wiki site. Right, they were building a wiki with all their lore, and I had to scrape through the old game files to find all the old books.
Oh no!
Put it in there. Which game did it come from? Which in-game character wrote it? Do we know which designer wrote it? Sometimes I'd have to go around asking, do we know who wrote this? No, not really, not anymore. And sometimes we did, right? And so that we could catalog it all. And writing things down is super important. And I think one of the cool things about the Elder Scrolls lore in particular, because it's had so many games, is you have the ability to have contradictory information from different sources. Like, so that was one of the fun things about the Elder Scrolls is there's so much there that you can have two characters talk about the same thing, and it's almost contradictory because they're coming at it from different angles and backgrounds, and you can write to that. So, it's definitely good to have a pile of stuff you're building on top of. When you're building something brand new, when you have to create all of that from scratch. I think the important thing is to kind of establish the baseline and then, let your team sort of go nuts with it within the boundary, right? Because you're trying to explore the extents together, right? What's humor going to mean this time around? Like, how deep do we get into mature themes, adult themes, right? Like how much do we get into politics, right? Sometimes talking about all the politics and the 300 years of war, et cetera, can be really boring. Obviously, like but it gets a bad rap because then you play something like Disco Elysium, which is about political philosophy, and the whole game really is about it in a way, and it's incredibly delightful, right? So I think that's really it is, especially when you're building something new, you have to sort of be constantly talking to each other and figuring out where are our boundaries going to be. And then once you figure that out, then you can really run with that.
Nice. I love the concept that you can have lore or even just storytelling in a game where there's contradictory based on, political stance or viewpoint or cultural paradigms, or that's cool that you can find two different pieces of lore that conflicted with each other. But hey, history is written by the victors, so you're going to have different points of views.
Yeah. That's one helpful guide when you're doing lore is try to write it based on perspective. That way you can contradict yourself later, and it all works.
Right. When it comes to lore, and even narrative pieces when you're putting them into the world. How do you decide, hey, this is going to be in a book or a piece of a found narrative, or is it going to be environmental design where it's, you notice a piece of graffiti or there's a tower that's fallen that tells a story, or it's actually going to be dialogue or narrative choices? Or
Yeah, sometimes it depends on who's doing it, right? Like if you're, at Bethesda, there was like people who were really great environmental storytellers. Like that was all they did. And and they spent a lot of time doing it. So anytime they had an idea, they figured out, how do I translate this into props and putting them just the right way to say something? Thinking about things like the lore for the Elder Scrolls, right? When we were talking about history and study, usually those went into books.
Right.
I designed the city of Markarth, for example, and it's built on top of this old dwarven ruin, Dwemer ruin. And I wrote a series of books from like an elven scholar and I had just read Gunstorms and Steel by, I think, Jared Diamond. And I was in that headspace, and I was like, oh, I really just want to write a bunch of books about like the sort of like armament breakdown of these Dwemer ruins. And so that if I had an actor like talk to you about that, actually now that I think about it, actually talking to him about it might have been really fun. But for some reason I was on a book kick, and that's how I decided to make it. It's sort of like when inspiration strikes and what headspace you're in usually dictates it.
In the duration of your extensive career, what are some of the challenges you've run into with world building? What are some of the hurdles you've run into that presented the most challenge?
Let's see. Yeah, I talked already a little bit about Far Harbor when we were coming up with the factions, right? We had the two factions, and having to come up with the third and then follow the rule of three. So there was that. Also, so part of it was also trying to get the player engaged in things that are below the surface. When I was putting Markarth together in Skyrim, one of the original ideas was, there should be a big conspiracy that's going on, like a trouble with like the authorities are involved, the conspiracy goes all the way to the top, that kind of a thing.
Gotcha.
And it was really difficult to get people when we were testing it. It was difficult to get people invested, and person just hands you a note and says, there's a conspiracy going on, right? You need to get to the bottom of it. And no one, people are like, we don't care. And so I was talking it over with one of the lead designers, and I was like, well, why don't we murder someone right in front of you, right? Have a really big, like, whoa, what just happened moment to get you interested. And that's when we came up with the idea of like, okay, someone murders someone in the market, and you're like, oh, was that just some random, crime? What's going on here? And then someone comes up to you and hands you the note saying, I know what's actually going on. You have to talk to me, in the shadows. Right. So I think getting the player invested in the story and caring is really hard. And I think one of the big skills to develop is it's not just building the world itself, right? The craft of it, but also figuring out how to ask people to care about it, right? Like, how do you build a bridge to your weird, right? The idea of like, oh, we're going to do this city that has this big conspiracy in it. That was sort of our weird. And the attack in the market is the bridge, right? It's a big, showy, flashy scene that asks you to care about what's happening here.
As a DM for many decades, that's a tool that you have to learn at some point. Is if you want your players to actually get involved and care, you have to give them an emotional connection. They don't care if there's a political thing going on, but if their little cousin or little sister is involved and they've been kidnapped, or there has to be an emotional connection there to pull them in.
Yeah, there has to be something, whether it's a character they hate or that they love, or even if it's like someone stole something that's theirs and they want to get theirs back, right? Or even, we're stuck on this island, we have to get out of here, some way in which they're invested in and have stakes in the outcome.
100%. It's something that comes up, speaking of narrative choices there, something that comes up in a lot of conversations and even in classes I've taken is that whole balance between player agency and the ability to feel like you're doing whatever you want, and then that crafted narrative experience on the other side of the scale where you're getting a very tailored emotional experience that's going to make you feel a certain way. Where do you fall on that scale? Where's the sweet spot for you, and how do you get there?
Oh, where do I fall on the scale? Well,
what do you like? What's your...
Oh, well, I have a lot of years in role-playing game design, so I love choices. Again, I'm a big fan of surprise, right? So when you can think of something that someone will want to do and you can allow that to happen, that's so great. Nice. And I think the branching narrative debate is like the oldest debate in quest narrative design, right? Like, oh, is it really worth it to do 3 versions of the story? You only see one of them, Yeah. And linear stories can be great. Like the promise of the linear handcrafted story is that you will get satisfaction by the end of it. You're kind of guaranteeing satisfaction. You can't always guarantee satisfaction, but the promise is that you'll be satisfied by the end of it, that characters will change, that situations will change, that you'll have this emotional arc. But the promise of branching narrative is you get to do what you want, right? And, there's a delight in realizing, hey, can I do this thing? And yeah, you can.
So ultimately it comes down to what the player wants, the player fantasy, what they're there for. So if you're crafting an open world RPG, then it's more on that side of the scale. If they're the sort of player who wants to sit down and do a visual novel with a very linear story that limited choices, then it's a fall down to the player in the end?
Sort of. I think it's less about, hey, the player can just do whatever they want, because obviously can't. It's a video game. There's only so many permutations. Right. I think it's the delight in kind of punching the glass and seeing if it holds, right? There's something like you see those like dumb physics experiments where does gravity work on watermelons, right? It splatters, and you know what the answer is going to be, but you're pushing the bounds of sort of what's acceptable and what's expected, and there's a glee that kind of comes from that, and I think that's core to the tabletop role playing game experience. Like I said, when we pass around stories of what happened around like the Dungeons and Dragons tale, we remember some of the big emotional scenes, but really the stories that carry and get passed on from table to table to table are usually the wacky things, the stuff no one expected. Like, oh, did you know that someone, like there's the Great Dread Gazebo story where the person just didn't know what a gazebo was and it sounds like a monster, so he just keeps attacking it.
A classic.
It's the classic one, and that's it. That's pushing against the glass of the illusion of the game, and when it pushes back and holds, and it supports it and says, yes, we're still here and it still works. There's a joy to be found in testing the boundaries and having it respond and notice that you're there.
That's what makes games magical.
Yeah, it's performative, right? You're performing and it's responding to you.
So, looking back on your career journey thus far, what advice would you give to young Will, or to a young designer, or somebody in your shoes 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 15 years ago?
Oh yeah, I think the best advice I can give you is you're in a creative, expressive medium, and there are no rules. Right? There really aren't any rules, right? Game development changes project to project, even year to year. What you might think is an ironclad, no, never do this rule one time is going to get completely upended another time. Someone will figure it out, right? Someone will chart new territory and all the rules will change. I think it's more important to understand, like when you're working in a group, right, on a big project, what rules really are. And they are essentially their shared beliefs, right? We believe that in doing things this way and in this being our goals, that's going to get us to this endpoint. But you don't really know if that's true, right? Because you're making something, right? You're expression and art is all about creating something from nothing, right? And you have no idea what the end is actually going to be, but you all need to have a shared sense of purpose and set of values if you're going to get there together, right? And so that's what the point of rules really are. And so that's how you can help distinguish when the rules are helpful and when they're not.
World building. I'm going to touch on it one more time before we start heading out the door here. But what's your favorite part? I got to know what, like when you're getting in there, rolling up your sleeves, what's your favorite part of the process? Or
my absolute favorite part of the process is when someone comes up with something that completely works and I never saw coming. That's my favorite part. Like I said, I got into this whole thing because of tabletop, and, tabletop role playing is all about people throwing you curveballs. But I love that. And in game development, that's also my favorite part. When you've built a world and someone creates their own story in it, that is something you completely didn't expect, but when you think about it, it completely works in the space that you've built.
Yeah.
That's great. That's how you know it's rich.
Oh, dude, you're describing my drug. That just gives me chills. That's amazing. So cool. All right. So we are kind of getting to the core of the podcast here. There's a question I like to ask everybody that rests at the heart of this whole thing. And that is, in my opinion, there exists a magical space where stories and games and novelists and comic book writers and actors and voice actors, all these people meet. And there's a shared space we can all just relax and be ourselves and get along. What ties this magical metaphoric space together?
Oh, man. I would say it's a desire to know everything you could be, right? When we're talking either, whether it's fiction or games, like the desire to go to another world, and in a lot of ways is a desire to see yourself in completely different circumstances, right? If I didn't have the external pressures or circumstances of my real life and I was in somewhere completely else with a completely different role set, who would I be? Who could I be? I think like even something like sports, like competition, right? You're trying to answer a fundamental question like, am I a winner? Or at least the winner for today. But am I a winner? Am I a loser? Have I picked the right side or the wrong side? Right? That's the drama of it. And I think fiction and games are the same. I think we're trying to ask ourselves who we could be, even stuff we know we aren't. Right? Like we know we're not like elves, right? Delving into the mines of Moria, but we can imagine ourselves in that space and we can kind of see all the possibilities of who we could be when we're going through that journey.
Yeah. Nice. I have a follow-up to that question I usually ask, and that is, in your opinion, what makes stories important? Or it could be in general, or it could be, why are stories important to Will?
Oh, why are stories important to me? That's I haven't thought about that in a while. I think for me, being able to tell a story in your head is in many ways a way of being able to rewrite who you are and fix who you are, at least in your own mind. Like I'm a warrior, right? Like after I make a decision, I go through all the possible scenarios. Like, what if I had done this? What if I had done that? And the idea of you can sort of this time you'll arrive at the perfect answer and everything will be okay. Like I think that's what save scumming is.
Yeah.
Right? Like if I'm a unapologetic save scummer, right? Like no, I need the perfect outcome, right?
Yeah.
And I think there's something very restorative about storytelling. And especially when you're making stories, right? Like there's something amazing about having someone respond to something that you did as if it's fixed. Like, oh, I can't believe in your game this happens. And I'm like, well, it didn't have to happen that way. I could have done something different. Right? I can just go back to the toolset and change it because I was the one making it. But to your audience, it's something that's set in stone, right? Because they don't have that power. Unless you're in the modding community. I mean, that's one of the joys of the modding community is that they get to see that part of it. But yeah, I think that's the thing about storytelling for me. It's in some ways We're all just trying to fix ourselves. And in some ways, the power of being a storyteller is you can change it. You have the power to change things.
Nice. Okay, before we start heading out the door here, I have what I like to call the quickfire round. Just quick questions, top of your head answers. Don't go too deep if you don't want to. What are you playing these days?
I was playing Alan Wake 2, which is delightfully insane. And I've also convinced some friends of mine to play Lethal Company with me, which is also delightfully insane. And that's a great game to play with no knowledge of what's going on.
What is your favorite game world and why?
Oh, I probably have to give it up for Shadowrun. That was my first role-playing game. I stole my brother's books, and I've been playing some version of Shadowrun probably, how long has it been? For like 25 years. So yeah, I'll give it up for Shadowrun.
What was your first Shadowrun character? Do you remember?
Oh, I don't even know. I probably made some decker with way too much description about the deck, because you could actually specify. It was like building your own computer, but with a tabletop role-playing game, right? How much RAM do I have for this? Which programs am I going to use? Yeah.
Very cool. What is an iconic line from a video game that still haunts you to this day?
Oh, Kim, I have to tell you, I don't have amnesia. I remember everything.
Oh, I haven't heard that one yet. That's a good dig. Good one. What are you reading right now? What's on the bookshelves or on your nightstand?
So my wife and I are reading the Terry Pratchett Discworld novels. I've never read them. And so we have a thing at night where I'll actually read the book out loud. And I do all the character voices. I do character voices for when I game master. So I'm like, I have to do all the voices whenever we're reading these books.
That's cool. Now I want to know what your voices sound like. Have you ran into death yet, Mort?
Yeah, death. Yes.
All right.
I am here at the end.
Or who's the dwarf, the tall dwarf? I don't know. It's been forever.
Oh, I don't know if I've hit the tall dwarf yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
I won't ruin anything. What 3 books do you think every writer or designer or creator should read or should have on the bookshelf?
All right. So I recommend reading Difficult Conversations, How to Discuss What Matters Most.
Uh-huh.
Having hard conversations that's part of the creative process, but also understanding why conversations are hard is key to understanding how characters really work and what they care about. Also, I gotta recommend any one of the Dungeons and Dragons players handbooks. 5th edition is really great. Going between describing mechanics and math to describing narrative, like, the paladin is a holy warrior who was gifted with a magical flaming sword from their patron deity. Like, switching between those two modes of writing is a real feat, and we take it for granted these days, but it's not easy. Yeah. And oh man, I'll cheat a little bit, and I'll say the third book I would recommend is The End Is Always Near by Dan Carlin. And that's really because I would really recommend his Hardcore History podcast. But the book itself is quite good. And I think historians teach us that, in the long view of history, the world has ended several times, or that there have been many, many different worlds, right? We have fictional worlds, but history has real different worlds that actually happen to people. So it's good to read up on your history.
All right, last one. This is the big one. If you could sit down at a gaming table with any 4 people, living or dead, anytime in history, and play a game, who would you sit with and what would you play?
Oh, man. Let's see. So who would I sit with? All right. I would pick Lao Tzu, the writer of the Tao Te Ching and the founder of Taoism. I think he would be amazing to talk to, although he might not talk at all, which would also be kind of amazing. And I think Arneson, one of the creators of Dungeons and Dragons, because obviously Gary Gygax, but I think Arneson would be really fascinating as sort of a number 2 person, the someone who was there for the whole time, but doesn't have the burden of the whole legacy and can probably be a little bit more honest about what had happened.
Mhm.
Steve Wozniak, probably for the same reason.
Yeah, that'd be interesting.
And Robin Williams, because he's delightful and he was a big nerd, and so I think that would just be a lot of fun. And I think I would probably have to run Blades in the Dark, because it's an improvisational style of a game, and I'm terrible at prep. So I have improv GM my entire GMing career.
So nothing wrong with that, man.
Yeah.
This is normally where I give you a chance to talk about anything you're working on that you want to boost. I mean, obviously, everybody should be paying attention to Something Wicked game and Weird Song. But is there anything going on?
Check out that somethingwickedgames.com and all of our social medias. I am also on social media. I think it's Shen 101 on the LinkedIn, and I will also be speaking at the Game Developers Conference in San Francisco in mid-March. So if you're going to that, swing by.
Take us home. Why don't you? Do you have any parting bits of wisdom? I'm going to give you the last word if you want.
Oh, sure. So I think the last thing I would say is, for when you're expressing anything, right? When you're engaged in any kind of art or making any kind of thing with a creative component, don't be afraid to put all of what you are into it, right? Because if there's one thing I've learned is that the art doesn't lie, right? It will reveal all of who you are, even if you don't want to, even if it tucks it into some corner somewhere, but you're not really actually going to be able to hide anything. So don't be afraid to show the world exactly who you are, and then also don't be afraid to ask the world to love you anyway.
The final echoes of our conversation are fading, so it's time to say farewell. My sincere gratitude to Will, whose insights have illuminated the path for aspiring game designers and seasoned veterans alike. And to you, dear listener, thank you for joining us. And be sure to come back for next episode when I sit down with Salavier Nilsson Jr. and Winter Mullinex to discuss diversity and representation in storytelling. And if these arcane tales have ignited a spark within, please share the magic by leaving a review, telling your fellow travelers, and hey, using that subscribe spell. May your stories be ever entwined with magic and your games filled with fantastical adventures. Safe travels, Wanderer. I will see you here again soon at the corner of story and game.